According to journalist Afua Hirsch, discussing race in contemporary Britain is still a radical act. In her latest book, British, Hirsch argues that the UK has failed to reckon with its colonial legacy, and in turn, important conversations around race, ethnicity and diversity have been silenced. The end result, she writes, is that bigotry and prejudice remains, quote, woven into the fabric of everyday British life, everywhere. But just how accurate is Hirsch's diagnosis, and what are her solutions? Joining me in the arena to debate this are Afua Hirsch and Claire Fox, the director of the Academy of Ideas in London. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Afua, a lot of liberals celebrate the fact that Britain is no longer the openly racist society that it once was. You disagree, and you write in your book, white supremacy is ever present in British society. How do you justify what is a pretty provocative, and I'm sure to a lot of white people, startling claim about the UK?
Well, first of all, it's not fair to say that I don't recognise that we have made progress in racism. I think violent, hostile, aggressive racism has definitely diminished. And when I speak to people 10 or 15 years older than me who experience being regularly chased down the street or beaten up because of their race, that's not something I recognise from my own experience. So I'm not saying that we haven't made progress, but I think what's happened is that because racism has become less visible and it's become more subtle and coded, we've become very complacent. And we have stopped recognising that race exists on multiple layers.
Claire Fox, subtle, coded, structural racism still exists. Afua calls it white supremacy. What's your response to that?
Well, I've no doubt that racism still exists. I think the subtle, coded point is quite important because I think it's so subtle and so coded that very often people are frightened about discussing race in the UK because they're frightened that they'll be, as the phrase goes, called out for being racist when they're not being racist at all. I think the difficulty is, and this is an aspect of identity politics that I feel very uncomfortable with indeed, is that rather than kind of taking people for what they say and for the ideas that they hold, we start to see people based on their ethnicity or indeed on their gender or any number of things. I mean, the thing about privilege, Afua will be aware that recently in the UK there's been some controversy about people saying that, for example, a white homeless person is somebody who's got white privilege, or that the suffragettes were white supremacists and so on. And this actually does, I think, unhelpfully reduce people to the colour of their skin, and that's what I meant by racialising society. And of course, I'm not addressing that to Afua.
But Claire, let me just clarify for the sake of
an objective point.
Claire, for the sake of our viewers, let me just clarify then, putting aside people, your own personal views or offence or not offence or people's uncomfortable feelings, just on the language we're using here, do you recognise that there is such a thing as white privilege in the UK today, that there is a bias across society, financially, educationally, towards the white majority still? Surely you would recognise that, or not?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that, and it's interesting that we only talk about white privilege recently. We used to talk about, until relatively recently, racism, something which I think many people wanted to fight against, and many people were racist. It's the kind of reduction of this to skin colour that I find unhelpful. I mean, we actually have a complicated picture in this country where, for example, white working class youth are not doing very well, but white working class boys, for example, are not doing very well in educational terms, whereas there's been an incredible improvement in how Bangladeshi young people are doing. There's whole differences within ethnicities and so on. So it's just not black and white. OK, let's put that to Afua. It's not black and white. There's an appropriate phrase. It's a complicated picture in the UK right now, and you're simplifying it.
I'm glad Claire has pointed to the complexity, because that's exactly what my book is about. I think we've become very simplistic in the way that we talk about identity and our narratives about race. Race and class intersect. The idea of calling a white homeless person someone benefiting from white privilege, to me, is absurd. You know, that people who are homeless are more likely to have had trauma in childhood, to have parents with alcohol and drug abuse, to have been in the care system. So they have suffered from multiple disadvantage based on class and poverty. At the same time, black people who are homeless and rough sleeping have even worse outcomes because they suffer from both class and race deprivation. It's true that white working class boys are doing doing very badly at school, but young black men between the ages of 18 and 26 are twice as likely to be unemployed as young white working class men from similar backgrounds. So we see in the data the way that race and class intersects and overlaps, yet there are still distinct types of disadvantage that affect minority people. This is not a competition.
Afua, let me ask you this question. A lot of people would nod their heads, agree with you on the points you're making about the data and the racism, and I'm sure Claire would agree with a lot of what you're saying about the actual racism in British society. But you go further in your book. You say, for example, in the midst of frenzied debate on the United States, you say, is in the midst of frenzied debate on what to do about all this, historical racism, white supremacy, Britain, in our inertia, arrogance and intellectual laziness, is not. Some would say that's because Britain just isn't as bad as the US when it comes to the legacy of slavery, when it comes to racism. Are you saying Britain is as bad as the US?
I think one of the reasons that we have been very complacent in being honest about our history of empire is because many people convinced themselves that the British Empire was far more benevolent and humane than the French, Portuguese or Belgian Empire, and therefore we should be proud of it. The reality can be both. You know, we didn't have the same legislated segregation and overt racism as the United States, which was a plantation economy, but we did enforce it in our colonies, and those colonies built the modern industrial British economy. So history is very complex. What I'm accusing Britain of is failing to be interested in its complexity. You know, we talk about abolition, but we don't talk about slavery. We have very much a victor's version of British history as a result of having won the Second World War, Claire, and having the sense that we were on the right side of history.
Claire, do you want to respond?
I honestly don't. I don't recognise this because every institution in Britain, it seems to me, is full of a kind of angst-ridden exploration of the fact that, oh my goodness, you know, we're a museum. Maybe we represent colonialism. Oh, what are we going to do about our empire's history? There's renaming discussions going on, discussions about statues and so on. If anything, I think we're over-preoccupied about our colonial past. I don't mind a debate about history. I feel as though, however, history is being plundered for the sufferings of people in the past, very often ethnic minorities in the past, almost as a way of talking about racism today, which is a very different thing. And I would suggest that whilst I want an intelligent discussion about history, that has got nothing to do, and the legacy of it has got nothing to do with the contemporary problems we face in relation to British
Afua is shaking
society.
her head and sighing heavily.
We have a hangover of slavery.
I don't know where to start. I don't know where to start with that. I fundamentally disagree with Claire. You look at our political leaders, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Michael Gove, they talk about history as a celebratory subject. Claire says that we learn too much and we're riddled with shame. How many people in Britain can name one of the African abolitionists who was fundamental to ending the slave trade? We talk about West India merchants in our literature and period dramas. We never call them slave owners or plantation owners. We found so many ways of coding this past so that it's more palatable. And to say, as Claire did, that this history is not relevant is absolutely absurd. There are people alive whose grandparents worked on plantations owned by British families who'd enslaved their ancestors. There are whole nations who are part of the Commonwealth whose identity is as a result of the transatlantic slave trade propagated and profited from by Britain. So this is very much a living part of history. My mother was born in the Empire, in a colony, the Gold Coast as it was, where she was taught that British culture and civilization was superior to her own.
I think what this does is this reduces us to our identity and our ethnicity in far too passive a way. I could say now, you know, as somebody from an Irish immigrant background, everything about me today is because of all the suffering that my family had. But to try and explain contemporary politics by actually accusing people of white supremacism because they don't know enough history, or even implying that white people in 2018 are somehow in any way implicated in the slave trade, or indeed that black people in this country, because their ancestors were slaves, are dominated by, determined by, is far too passive a way of seeing people. Anti-racism for me was transcending our identities and our history and making history, not actually being victims of it,
Claire,
as you would have us
Claire,
be. I think it's
Claire,
actually frightening.
Isn't it easy, though, and I'm sorry to have to ask you this, but given you're a member of the white majority in the UK, isn't it easier for a member of a majority to say, let's transcend our identities? Isn't that, by definition, what privilege allows you to do?
Well, that's the whole point, is now I'm reduced to the fact that I happen to be white, right? Identity is a very important part of everybody's lives. What politics allows us to do is to transcend that in order to fight the contemporary problems that we all face.
Afua, 20 seconds, last word.
this is not about you, Claire, or this is not about individual white people. This is about a system. And I think what you're saying keeps reinforcing this misunderstanding, the idea that I'm accusing individual people, or I'm accusing people of that they should feel guilty for what the empire did. This is not about that. This is about systems of race and class that are highly relevant in people's life experience, in their outcomes, in advantage and disadvantage. And we don't talk about them. And I'm trying to start a conversation about them because they matter and because we want the same things. I would love for us to be able to transcend race in this country, but we can't do so until we've acknowledged race, and we've as of yet failed to do so.
We'll have to leave it there. Claire Fox, Afua Hirsch, thanks so much for joining me in the arena to debate this. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.